All right, I admit it. I'm a James Bond fan. Sometimes. There was a time when to admit such a thing in certain circles was akin to declaring that the cheeseburger was the very height of American cuisine. I like cheeseburgers. Sometimes. My first exposure to the world of James Bond was fleeting at best. The year was 1963, and my family was shopping at a local A&P when I noticed a poster in the store window. It was for an upcoming film called Dr. No, featuring the adventures of a gentleman spy who had a license to kill. I didn't quite understand what that meant. Also on the poster was a long line of beautiful women in various stages of undress. I was just beginning to understand what that meant. Around this time, I had picked up the comic book tie in for Dr. No, and while it was okay, I was much more interested in what was going on over at Marvel Comics with the first Spider Man and the first Fantastic Four. In light of all that, Dr. No sort of faded into the background. Also, it was a time of transition for my family, as we were moving from the semi suburban landscape of Bay Terrace to the hard, scrabble streets of Washington Heights. A few months after moving into the city, I did manage to see From Russia with Love at a small, tiny rinky dink theater called the Cinema 181. And I loved it. And to this day, it is my favorite Bond film. A few months after that, during Christmas week, I got to see Goldfinger during its premiere engagement at the DeMille Theater in downtown Manhattan. And I loved it because sometimes all that glitters is gold. And Thunderball was scheduled to open the following Christmas. But in the intervening summer of 1965, United Artists did something brilliant. They released Dr. No and From Russia with Love on the first James Bond double bill, with a tagline that read, James Bond is back to back. I got real excited about this. I would happily see From Russia with Love anytime, and it would also give me the opportunity to catch up with Dr. No. Great. Except the double bill wasn't opening anywhere in our neighborhood. It was opening seemingly in every other neighborhood, but for some strange reason, not ours. My brother Eddie and I put our heads together, and after some deliberation, it was decided we'd go see this double bill at the Valentine Theater way up in the Bronx on Fordham Road. Now, both Eddie and I were born in the Bronx, but we had spent our childhoods in Bay Terrace. So this expedition to the Valentine Theater was one of our first early attempts at negotiating a way around the city by ourselves. And so the route was planned out with the meticulous detail that only young boys on a mission can truly render. Step 1. Walk from our building on 178th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue to 181st Street. From there, catch the bus across the Washington Bridge, not the George Washington Bridge, to University Avenue in the Bronx. Remain seated until finally getting off the bus at the juncture of Tremont Avenue and the Grand Concourse. Step 2. Take the Grand Concourse bus and get off at Fordham Road. Step 3. Walk 2.5 blocks east along Fordham Road until you come to the Valentine Theater on the left. The theater opened at 12, but we got there at 11 as planned. Just in case. So, how was it? It was the best Saturday afternoon at the movies that any young boy in the early 60s could ever hope for. It was perfect. Now, I know to many fans, those early films in those early years seem rather dated and quaint. In fact, Dr. No has recently been described as vanilla. But when Dr. No opened, it was slightly transgressive. Oh, yes, it was recognized as nothing more than a high priced piece of hokum, and yet it still managed to raise a few eyebrows, in particular during the scene where James Bond shoots Professor Dent. Yes, the professor was a bad guy, and yes, he had it coming. But there's a shot where he's laying on the floor after Bond has shot him, and we see Bond in the same frame as he shoots him again. Shoots him in the back. But the way actor Richard Dawson flinches, the audience laughs because it looks like Bond shoots him in the ass. Something similar happened a little later in the film A Fistful of Dollars. There's a shot of Clint Eastwood's six-shooter in the foreground of the frame while he shoots four guys in the background. This sort of thing was rarely, if ever, done, and the critics were fuming. But times were changing, and in retrospect, and with regard to movie violence, not necessarily for the better. The church was also upset by these films. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned them out of hand. Well, that wasn't too difficult. If a movie didn't have Bing Crosby as a priest, it was already sacrilege in the eyes of the church. But then the church got crafty. Under the guise of a sociological study, the Irish Christian Brothers, who taught throughout the Archdiocese of New York City, held a special class to examine just what was the appeal of these ungodly movies, stressing two particular points. One, nobody, but nobody has a license to kill. All right, a debatable point perhaps, but well-intentioned nevertheless. And two, sex was only for procreation, and procreation only. Well, that didn't exactly fly with us. Around the same time, Dell Publishing produced a glossy magazine all about the world of James Bond. Basically, it contained still frames from the first three films with some publicity photos of the actresses in bikinis. A friend of mine who lived in the same apartment building and who was 4 years my senior asked if he could borrow it, and I said, sure, just bring it back when you're done. That evening, my friend's father came banging on our apartment door and screaming that I was passing pornography to his kid. What? My, my father was, to say the least, a little flabbergasted, although I don't think he really took this seriously. But this man had made such a stink about it that some form of redress was necessary, so he threw it down the incinerator shaft. Now, some fans may think that those early years and those early films are dated and quaint and vanilla, but in the beginning, Bond was trouble, and that was kind of cool. Sometimes. See you around the campus.